And I'm Kayla, and I'm a junior at HB, and we'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout this discussion. So thank you for joining this conversation, and without further ado, we'd like to provide a brief introduction for Representative Horn.
Representative Horn attended Hathaway Brown for high school. After graduating from UChicago Law School, she worked in corporate finance and law, and then became a law clerk for a federal judge. She then went on to working as an assistant U.S. attorney for the criminal division. Representative Horn then moved to Salisbury and chaired the Board of Trustees of Indian Mountain School until June 2018.
Currently, Representative Horn is a member of the Connecticut House of Representatives, where she focuses a large portion of her work on environmental policy. And as part of the Environmental Committee, she has helped to implement a Connecticut policy called the Extended Producer Responsibility, where producers of waste are responsible for disposal of their products with the goal of shifting product disposal away from the public sector and incentivizing the use of greener products. And this waste program is active in quite a few industries, such as household electronics and paints, and is working to expand in the future.
Currently, the US is lacking in national recycling laws, so it's the responsibility of the states to make recycling initiatives. On the Environmental Committee, Representative Horn is working to change this and not only help Connecticut's environmental policies, but also the US's as a whole. And we're really excited to learn more about her work.
After Representative Horn speaks, there will be Q&A. If you're interested in asking a question, please chat it to just the chat or me or Magana if that would make you more comfortable, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Also, please note, as Mr. Thompson said, that this meeting is going to be recorded. And now, without further ado, we'll hand it off to Representative Horn. And once again, thank you for joining this conversation with us.
Thank you both for that incredible introduction. I can't tell you, it is always such a pleasure to be with this versions of this group over the years, because I am a loyal and a loyal HB alum, very proud of that institution and my friends there and the incredible teachers I had there. And I also am part of a family where I am the only one who did not graduate from Hotchkiss. So I get ribbed from that from time to time, but I don't mind. I'm just fine about that. So I'm thank you for the opportunity to be with you tonight to talk about, I hope, a range of topics. I know that the focus here was on the Environment Committee in particular, but I'm going to back up a little bit. And first of all, my responsibilities, I just started my second term as a legislator, and my responsibilities are, I am on the Environment Committee, which I have been on since the beginning. I also am going to serve on the Energy and Technology Committee, and I'm going to chair I am chairing the Public Safety Committee, which is particularly relevant right now because of events of the last week, which I also want to touch on a little bit. And I guess I wanted to talk about, sort of to back up a little bit, I'll say when I was at HB, I ran for pretty much everything. And then I was involved in politics and policy, and I'm a lawyer. I was a federal prosecutor, and I did a lot of pro bono work in a variety of areas for many years. But I have done many things over the years, and I have, and in being a legislator in particular, having worked in finance, having worked in law, having worked for a lot of nonprofits locally, you build up as you move forward, you build up a series of relationships with people and trust with people. And particularly when you arrive, being a legislator, you should have areas of specialty, but you are also a generalist. I have to vote on all kinds of things that I will never be expert at, not just the areas that I really go deep in. And so having formed those relationships, and some of them go right back to high school. I have friends from high school that I can call when I have questions about particular areas in their expertise. Those really matter in the long run, because we need to be able to rely on one another. And that in particular, I think, is important when you work on environmental issues, because a critical part of environmental policy is that you are advocating for and creating policy that isn't really about your own, often not about your own self-interest. It's about the common good. It's about, goods that the public good, goods that everybody benefits from, not just you. It's about, externalities, in other words, costs that get imposed by that are not paid by the person who benefits from them. So a corporation might pollute, but somebody else, there's a cost for that. Somebody else has to pay that cost, but they don't pay that cost. So it's all about expanding your viewpoint and understanding, reaching out to people, and it's It's also about environmental justice, because often, communities that get affected the most severely by environmental devastation tend to be vulnerable communities. And those are the same communities, by no coincidence, that are affected most by COVID, by discrimination, by, pretty much every serious issue that we face in the legislature is faced more seriously by communities of color in particular, and other vulnerable, economically vulnerable communities throughout the state and throughout the country. So it really forces you to think outside yourself. And I, at the moment, Magana, emphasized or spoke a little bit about extended producer responsibility, which is basically about taking costs that, all that we're ordering a lot of things online these days, which means there's a lot of packaging showing up at our doors, and what happens to that, and whose responsibility is it? And it has to go somewhere, and who's paying the cost of it going somewhere? Is it the town? Is it the individual citizen? And should it also be the producer who is benefiting from that and yet just pushing that cost off onto someone else? And so, extended producer responsibility is about taking that cost and trying to reallocate it and put it back on those who benefit from those costs. And I think it's a really good, it is a good, it is a good.
It's like 9 to 1.
Thanks. Am I back on? It's a metaphor really for everything we do, because we have to think about other people. And so for me, that's also true with the whole reason that I decided to run for office in the first place. And I am a Democrat, and I'm proud of that, but I have been a Republican in my life. In fact, when I was at 18 years old at Hathaway Brown and registered to vote for the first time, I registered as a Republican. I came from a Republican family, and my mother in particular was very politically active, and she believed in, personal responsibility and things that I still hold dear. But as time went on, for me, that I consider, political parties containers, and what's in those containers shifts over time, and you better look at what's in them and make your own choice. It's not a team. This is not the brown and the gold team, if that's still a thing in Hathaway Brown. This is about, your values. And over time for me, I, pretty much once I made it through college, I looked at what the container, what was in each of the containers, and decided that I aligned better with the Democratic Party. And so when I had thought about running for office for many years before I did, but it was the election of Donald Trump that actually was the last straw for me that made me want to commit, because I believed it fervently in certain policies. I had built up a set of skills that were relevant to do something about those policies, and I had built up relationships with people that could help me form good policy. And actually also, legislating in particular is a collaborative enterprise. I have 150 colleagues in the Connecticut House, and they come from all different walks of life, and they have different amounts of time and to devote to this. We are a part-time legislature, which is challenging. And so I really, that communal aspect of it, and working with people from all different kinds of people, was something that I really very much looked forward to. And so for me, that was the tipping point. And so I will, when I began, this is personal, I was a little baffled how we had come to be in the position we were in 2016. So I made a point. The district that I represent in Connecticut is very politically diverse. It is the largest, it's very rural, and it is the physically largest district in the state. And so it takes a good deal of time for me to get throughout it, and there really are a whole range of political viewpoints. So my first commitment, and the most satisfying thing I did in the early days of running for office, was get out and knock on doors of all kinds of people who had very different political opinions from me. And that included, for me, a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump. And it was understanding what motivated that, and not just othering them and deciding that I don't have anything in common with them. They're, I don't understand you at all. It was an effort to try to understand them. Although I do not support and have never supported Trump himself, I can find a lot of empathy for people who made that decision, particularly in 2016, and that I think makes me a better legislator, because I made it about the individual policies and not about the team, and not about who you happen to vote for in the moment. I will say that that also means that and we can talk about this more. I want to get to your questions. The events of the last week are stark and frightening. I now, because I chair the Public Safety Committee in particular, I have a lot of legislators who are reaching out to me all the time concerned about our own safety. We actually had our swearing in on the same day of the attack on the Capitol, the insurrection that happened on Wednesday, and ours went very differently. We had a lot of protesters, and they were not polite. It was kind of nasty, but they were kept at an appropriate distance, and we certainly heard them. And but there was no destruction, there was no invasion of the our own Capitol space. And in fact, we were at the close of it on Zoom in a meeting like this. We heard our leaders, newly elected leaders from both the Republican and Democratic Party, talk about their deep and abiding respect for one another, and for the election, and for the process, and for listening, deeply, and tackling, not avoiding, but tackling difficult issues by speaking to one another, not retreating to our bubbles, but engaging in that thorny, difficult process that is making good policy. And it was a very different experience than what we saw happening in Washington, which I believe in particular, I think our history in this country is filled with examples of things that we have just decided to turn the page on and sort of stick our fingers in our ears and pretend never happened, and just sort of patch it up, and let's just move forward, and not really unearth what's beneath it. And I think we pay the price for that. And so one of the things that I and a lot of my colleagues have been focusing on, I am a Democrat, but I consider myself a moderate, but I am in a moment where I don't want to let things slide. And I want to, I had a particular moment recently, and then I'll stop and hear your questions, but I was in my office in Hartford for a long day on Wednesday doing some work, and I had a guy outside my office who was doing a little carpentry work outside, and I had the television on. I was watching what was happening in Washington, and we were chatting about that a little bit, and he sort of at some point rolled his eyes and said, we know what the result's going to be. I mean, it's not going to change the result. Biden's going to be president, and if there was fraud, we'll never know. And I was working, and I didn't really want, he was a nice guy, and he was doing some work for me, and I didn't want to have an argument with him, and so I let it slide. And all the way home, I regretted that, because we have to learn to politely, maybe politely is the wrong word, but not angrily, not emotionally, but stop and say, that's not right. We do know this was a fair election, and we know that for a host of reasons. And we have to find ways to not avoid difficult conversations, to wade in and be willing to step up and say, these are my values. That's different from what you're saying. And I want you to understand that I don't agree with that, and here's why. And you don't have to necessarily have a big argument with them, but I think the necessity for all of us to articulate those values all the time, because those little acts build up over time, and words have consequences. And I think in this moment in particular, it's important for us all to find ways to articulate that and seek out people who disagree with us and have those conversations. It's good practice. So with that, I'd love to hear from you and answer any questions that you have.
Great. Thank you so much, Representative Horn, for your comments. And now we'll get started with the Q&A session. Again, we encourage all of you to send me or Kayla your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So to start off, the first question is, why did you choose to go into business after law school?
Well, actually, I didn't. I was in business, but it wasn't after law school. So I actually went to work for JP Morgan after I graduated from college. And that was for a variety of reasons. I will say honestly that part of it was because those were very competitive jobs to get. I did not, I knew I wanted to go to graduate school in some form, and I knew I didn't have any money to pay for it. So, and I will add also to that, that one of the things that I was really excited about after graduating from college was to support myself, to be, not a burden, to pay my bills, to balance my budget, to, look after my own financial affairs. And I was fortunate enough to get, a job at JP Morgan, which helped me do that. Now, it was not, the pay scale is a little different today than it was then, but it did enable me to live on my own and save a chunk of money for law school. So I went to work after college. I went to work for JP Morgan for 4 years, and then I went to law school. So after law school, I knew that I didn't, having been at JP Morgan, I knew that I did not actually want to end up in corporate law. I knew that I wanted to work for the government, or the public sector in some form. And so I ended up at the US Attorney's Office.
Thank you for your answer. The next question we have coming in, and just a reminder, if you have a question, feel free to chat it to me or Megana. Our next question is, do you think people pay enough attention to political candidates' stances on climate change when voting?
Probably not. So I will say that is one of the challenges in, I have a very good friend who is the chair of the Environment Committee this year, and I'm very excited about that, because she and I, one of the things we agree on is that sometimes we all, like any other kind of policy, but particularly environmental policy, we can get sort of attracted to a shiny object and a short-term thing that feels good, but isn't necessarily the best policy, and we miss the big picture. And if we don't set those big picture goals, and I will tell you that a lot of the push certainly in our capital, and certainly throughout the country, to make sure that legislators pay attention to that big picture goal, is the activism of young people like you, who show up in our capital and in other capitals and say, no, why have you done it? Why are you continuing to do it this way? This is my, world. This is my planet. This is my country. I want it to look different. And that gets the attention of people, because they have been very active, particularly on the environmental side. And there are a bunch of organizations that have started up in Connecticut that have gotten the attention of legislators. So it can be a diffuse thing, climate change. What does that mean? Because it can mean a lot of different things, and sometimes it's not visible, the things you do, and so that can be unsatisfying to somebody who wants to point to something short term that they've done. But so I would say, yes, we do not particularly. One more thing that legislatures are bad at is long-term thinking, because everybody tends to be focused on a 2-year time horizon. When's my next election? And so if I can't do it in 2 years, it doesn't exist. And we have to make sure that we have through lines of people, and that we commit to policy that is a longer term goal in order to make real change in the environment, and climate change in particular.
Our next question is, we live in divided and in particular polarized times. My generation has seen bipartisan legislation repeatedly fail due to partisan gridlock within the Senate. What advice do you have for young people who begin to feel disillusioned about potential change? Would you consider dismantling the filibuster?
I would definitely consider dismantling the filibuster. I'm glad we don't really have any equivalent to that in Connecticut. And it would be a barrier to policy, because we do have, I'm sure on both sides, I see it in the Republican. I'm in the majority in Connecticut. Connecticut is a Democrat, has a democratically controlled both House and Senate, and also our governor is Democratic. So you see those procedure. What we do have in Connecticut, the equivalent is we have a tradition of never shutting down debate. And so you have a few people who are really willing to talk something to death. And it gets in the way of good policy sometimes, because a couple people object to it and have decided that it's an issue that they can get publicity for. So I definitely would support getting rid of the filibuster. The other thing that I would suggest is, if you want to start to reduce partisan gridlock, talk to people who disagree with you. talk to people who have a different background than you, figure out what their life is like. Maybe they voted for somebody you wouldn't support. Try to figure out why, because maybe there's some of the why you might agree on, and some of it you might be able to, you might be persuaded by something that they did. You might figure out that there's a better source of information that you can share. You're not always going to win them over, but I have, in my own campaign, I have talked about, we have a very data-driven, campaign now, where every conversation I have with a potential voter, we're all ranking on a scale of 1 to 5. Somebody, who's definitely going to vote for me as a 1, somebody who will never vote for me as a 5. And I have a very politically diverse district. And some of the conversations that I found the most personally rewarding were the people that I feel like I moved them from a 5 to a 4. They may not vote for me, but they don't hate me. And I can't be so easily characterized as, oh, that, those crazy tax and spend Democrats. No, we have a lot in common. And then you have to engage. And when you know somebody and you engage with them repeatedly, it's much harder to vilify them. My final point on that is this is much harder in the social media world. So we have to find ways to get around that.
Thank you. On the topic of characteristics and sort of vilifying people, somebody's asking, policymaking probably involves balancing tons of conflicts between different interest groups. And do you have a set of values you broadly apply to find that balance, or is it more on a case-by-case basis?
So I have a couple of practices that I engage in. So what we have is, there are a lot of lobbyists that come and advocate for certain interests. And first of all, lobbyist is not always a bad word. Sometimes we sort of characterize them and they themselves characterize themselves as the black hat lobbyists, meaning they're working for profit corporations, for example, or the white hats who are working for the nonprofits. But they're really not. They're there to advocate their case, and often are great sources for information. And so what you have to know when they're coming into you is and I often make them fill out a form. What do you want from me? What are you pushing? Who do you work for? Make sure you get all those incentives in line and that you understand that. And then another thing I always make somebody do who's pushing for a certain position is to articulate the best case on the other side. And if they can't, they're not good at their job, and they're not being totally straight with you. And so that tells you learn over time then who you can trust. And there's some people who represent interests that I don't agree with at all, but they're lobbyists actually I do trust, because they're honest with me and they don't fudge the information. And I know that when I call on them, I will get a real answer.
One student's wondering, if you could enact one environmental policy right now, what would it look like?
That's a good question. There's a lot of them. So I will say, I don't know that this is certainly not going to save the world, but I am definitely focused this term on waste. We, particularly in this country, we produce a lot of waste. We don't pay attention to how much. We don't pay attention to it individually. We don't pay attention in terms of the quantity that we generate. We don't pay attention to the rules for recycling, which can be quite complicated, and when you don't follow them, that means it doesn't work, or it becomes more expensive. So we can make a lot of improvements if we could find ways to, take the food waste out of it and compost it and regenerate it. And that, to me, that also ties to a lot of the farms I have in my district who are trying to do anaerobic digestion, and so that you can repurpose things. And we are filling the world up with an awful lot of garbage, and that is something. And for me, it's a satisfying piece of policy to work on, in particular, because it's not really partisan, because it's towns. It's costing towns a lot of money. It's environmental justice, because particularly the plants that burn garbage, tend to be located in vulnerable communities, and they are paying the environmental costs of that. So it's an issue that it can align a lot of disparate interests to try to address that problem. So it's satisfying, and it's immediate, and it really needs attention.
On the topic of the environment, we have a lot of environmental questions coming in, so I'm just going to combine two of them. One person's asking, what has been the biggest threat to success in making environmental change in your career? And then somebody else is asking, what do you think the Biden administration is going to prioritize regarding the environmental issues?
Okay, so what was it? The first one is the biggest impediment, right?
Yeah.
Uh, it is the short-term thinking, because environmental policy can be costly in the short run, and but it pays off in the long run, not, on a host of things. And so we have to make sure we measure those things and don't let them be too intangible, and that we put those long-term costs of polluting and the long-term benefits of being respectful about the environment up front, so that we can see them and force people to make decisions that are in the long-term interest of all of us. So it is, short-term thinking is definitely the biggest impediment for real environmental change. The Biden administration, I will say, I don't I'm really, I feel good about the beginning, and he seems to be putting some real environmentalists in positions of authority. So I don't know what I have to say. I mean, would think rejoining the Paris Accords would be, I think, is he has stated, is one of his things that's going to happen immediately, and to just rejoin the world conversation, because anybody who works on environmental policy, I happen to work on in Connecticut, but none of the issues only affect Connecticut. In fact, Connecticut's air quality is poor because of pollution coming from Ohio. So we're all connected, and the same is true for the United States and the rest of the world. And so we have to rejoin the international community, and I think Biden will do that.
So a lot of us on this call are high schoolers that are going to college soon. So one question is, what advice would you give to an incoming freshman to maximize their time in college and to find a satisfying career?
Gosh, there's so, I have college students in my own house right now who have been home since Thanksgiving, and they're starting to go back to their potentially go back to their actual college campuses in the next few weeks. But I would say try different things. Again, never taken a dance class, take a dance class. Do something that really puts you outside your comfort zone, that you're willing to just open yourself up to, because those are sometimes some of the classes that you remember more than any other class you take. And then this is going to be something that I'm sure you hear from all of your teachers, which is, reach out, form relationships with your teachers and your professors. Most of them, not all of them, are in the business because they actually like college students. And so those relationships are also very valuable. I myself, that was a big part of why I chose the University of Chicago for law school, because it's a small school. And I wanted to know my professors, and I did, and I do still. And that makes a difference, because that also is part of those relationships you're building over the course of your life that will serve you and give you resources in a whole host of directions. And I think particularly today, it's less and less likely that you will be in one career your whole life. You will probably change a few times, and the skills that you build will still be useful, but not necessarily in ways that you predict. So find things that bring you joy. Try to find some balance in your life. And I guess the other piece is don't worry about the gaps in your resume. I had and this is a little bit contrarian advice, but I definitely was one of those like rule-driven kids who I wanted to do this and then this and then this, and I had a pretty laid out for myself what my goals were. And I spent a term in college in Ireland, and I was an English major and read a lot of Joyce. And I had an advisor on an independent project who was a poet. And she at one point looked at my course of action, and she said, you just need to go off, walking in Ireland, just go away for a couple of weeks and just go walking. You need to get off the path and just reset yourself and figure out why you're here and what you're doing. And I think that checking in with yourself from time to time, that you're not just externally checking somebody else's boxes, but that you're doing something that matters to you, because there's a lot of ways to succeed in the world. And you need to make sure that you're doing something that is meaningful, and that when you wake up in the morning and look at yourself in that mirror, you're proud of what you've done and how you've conducted yourself and what you've learned that day, and just, little advances along the way.
Thank you. That's great advice. And shifting gears a little bit back to politics, someone's wondering, frankly, a big theme in politics, especially in younger generations, is anger and frustration. Can anger ever be a useful political tool? And when it involves, oh, I don't even know if I can pronounce this word, vitriolic disagreement on issues you view as uncompromisable, what do you recommend?
So I would say anger is useful if it gets you up off the couch, I guess. It gets you to do something, but it is rarely anger, I think, in the end, is most destructive to you, to us. And we all are angry from time to time. I'm angry, plenty of the time, but I try not to let it, fear and anger are, similar things, and we're not our best when we're acting out of anger or fear. We're often, we're not at our most generous. We close down to other perspectives, and I try to understand that in other people. Like, from my perspective, I one of the things that I've worked on is try to understand that even if somebody's delivering a message to me in anger or with vitriol, to try to not respond in kind, and to, try to understand exactly what that person is saying, and to take the tenor of the conversation down. And I got to tell you, it works an awful lot of the time. I get some very angry emails, and I respond, and I try to answer their question, and sometimes use a little humor. And doesn't always work, but it works more than you think it will. That said, I also think, one of the great joys of being a legislator is that messy group of humans that you work with. And it does take some of my colleagues are much more ideologues than I am. And they, are, stand up on a soapbox and pound the table, insisting that this change needs to happen now. That's not my temperament, but I admire the heck out of them, because you need people like that too, who are willing to stand up and push things and say, why do we do it that way? We shouldn't do it that way. That system should all change, because sometimes they're right. And without people who are willing to really push up against that boundary and say, this isn't a good, this boundary shouldn't be here. It doesn't make any sense. And it's, not serving us anymore. Change never happens, because inertia is powerful. So I am really glad that we have different approaches. That said, I don't really think vitriol ever has a place. I try to understand it when other people are, I have a lot more empathy for people who are acting with vitriol and fear when they're really afraid, and people of all kinds of people who are losing their foothold in, in society, in economic terms or whatever, and are afraid of their future, sometimes don't act in nice ways. And I try to be understanding of that fear, and not to respond in kind, but to try to understand where they're coming from, and to try to build something more positive. But I myself, I'm pretty careful about the way I speak about things, because it can be hurtful.
Great. So the next question is, where does your campaign funding come from?
So Connecticut has a fantastic public financing system for candidates. And so campaigning as a state legislator in Connecticut is not, as costly as, running for US Senate, for example, because I have a smaller district to cover. But so what Connecticut does is, if you, as a state legislator, and it's different for different positions in the state, it goes all the way up through the governor's campaign. But for a state legislator, I have to raise $5,000, and it has to consist of at least 150 gifts, donations from people within my district, small donations below $250 each. And most of them are below $100 each. That enables lots of people to participate, and it makes sure you have local support. but it's not, it is a very raisable amount of money. And then once you get that, I am entitled, I get a grant from the state that that is another $25,000. And that gives me about a little over $30,000 to run a campaign. Now, any of you who've ever worked in politics, and when I first ran for office, I had a lot of friends who've run campaigns in other parts of the country, and they said, $30,000, you can't possibly run a campaign on $30,000. Yes, you can. And my kind of campaign anyway, which is to say I'm not running for, I don't have to cover the whole state, and I'm not buying television ads. You can do that. We have gotten ourselves into this money race where, campaigns are more and more and more expensive. And I think a lot of the time that means political consultants are making a lot of money, but not necessarily sometimes generating good information, but not always. And we're in an arms race there, and it's a problem. So what Connecticut's system means is that I spend a couple weeks really raising money. And then the rest of the time, I don't have to think about how big a check you can write me. I have still from time to time, my friends in the district who work on national campaigns will say, oh, I need to get you in front of this, these movers and shakers who can, really write you checks. No, you don't. Every person in my district matters just as much as any other person in my district, and that is powerful. It also enables, a lot of people who don't have, it's not just wealthy people who can self-finance their own campaigns who can run for office. So it is it's a good system. We need to have more public financing for campaigns nationally as well.
We're going to try to ask as many questions as we can before 8:45. So just another question that's being asked is, can you talk a little bit more in detail about a specific environmental change or policy that you've helped pass or enact?
Sure. So one of my favorite ones from 2019 was we passed a plastic bag ban. And one of the reasons why it was my favorite is because, it was something that I was advocating when I was running for office. And I had a group of 8th graders from a local school who wanted to work on the issue. And so they worked alongside me. And when we had, when you go through the legislative process, you have, first propose a piece of legislation, and then every piece of legislation has to have a public hearing, which means the public, has an opportunity to come in to Hartford. Then now it's all on Zoom. But to, and give testimony. And so I had this group of about, 15, 20 8th graders who came to Hartford, and they got to be the first people to testify on this bill. And they were so informed and detailed and authoritative and clear. And they got so much respect from young people. Really can command a lot of respect from legislators. It's hard to be cynical and pass the buck when you have young people standing up and saying, why not now? Do it now. We need to do this now. And here are the 10 reasons why. And it was a lot of fun. There's a lot of surprising opposition to passing a plastic bag ban, that it was not easy, and it had been proposed before, but there were a lot of other legislators who were supporting it as well. And so the process was really fun, and we passed it, and we now have a plastic bag ban in Connecticut. So
to continue with the policy making, one question we have is, what does the policy making process look like, and how do you persuade others to follow through with policy proposals?
So what the process looks like is, and this year, because it's virtual, everything is a little bit different, and we're all figuring it out, because Connecticut is known as the land of steady habits. And we have a very paper-driven government. And so it is a little bit hard to shift the gears and move the ship in a different direction. But basically the process is, Connecticut is a part-time legislature, which means it's not a part-time job for those of us who work on it year-round, and I definitely do. But we sit in the first year of a 2-year term, we sit in session from January to June, and the second year it's from February to May. And so this year we were sworn in last week on the 6th, and immediately we start the process of every legislator is permitted to propose bills so we have until January 22nd, which is a little bit longer than usual. Usually that deadline comes fast. Last time it was 10 days after being sworn in, which is a challenge. And so it can be just ideas at that point. But you submit a proposal, or sometimes it's fully drafted, and then it goes through a process where it gets divided up. It gets the groups decide which committee it should go to, depending on what it is about. And then we have nonpartisan offices that do the Office of Legal Research that you can use to help you, ask, how do other states do this? Has our legislator ever tried to do this before? What happened? Did it pass? Did it not? I mean, what were the what is the state of affairs? And they're fantastic nonpartisan resource. We also have an office, a bill drafting office, that can make sure that the language fits in with the overall statutory structure in the state and the constitutional structure. And we have an office called the Office of Fiscal Analysis, which can give you an idea of how much a bill is going to cost. So you go through that process, you get that information, it gets assigned to a committee. Then committees will decide. Usually here we get thousands of proposed bills. This year it's going to be less for a variety of reasons, but usually, and it's the job of the committee chairs, which I am now doing, of weeding out through some of those and deciding these ones I'm interested in and we're going to have a hearing on. These ones we're not going to do this year. This one maybe we'll study for a little bit more. And so every bill that has to move forward has to pass that, has to have support from the leadership of the committee. So the plastic bag ban got assigned to the Environment Committee. The Environment Committee leadership had to decide, this is important, we should have a hearing on it, and it should get drafted. So it gets drafted, you have a public hearing, which allows, again, the relevant government people who, so we have a department in Connecticut, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. They would come in and submit testimony, and members of the public can sign up and submit testimony, both written and verbal. And then, so every bill has to have a public hearing. Once it's had a public hearing, it has to be voted out of committee. And so you have a vote in the committee. If it's voted out of committee, then maybe it goes to another screening committee, which decides which bills that have been voted out of committee are actually going to get a vote in both the House and the Senate. So as you can see, there are a lot of steps along this way that you can lose track of a bill, and not just because it's bad policy. Sometimes it's because maybe you didn't listen to the legislator who runs that committee. You weren't respectful of them in a particular environment, or you didn't do your homework and you didn't have the answers to the questions that she needed answered. And so she decided, she wasn't ready to hear that, and she's not going to, there's a lot, you have to build support for what you're doing at every step of the way, which means for me, I having built relationships in my first term, I now, the chairs of all the, committees, the relevant committees, are people who I like and trust. And I hope they also like and trust me. And when you are reliable and responsible with other people, the scope of legislation is so broad, there is no way that any of us are going to be expert in all of it. We have to rely on one another. And when you build that web of relationships, and you're somebody that somebody else will call when they have a question about public safety or what have you, that helps you move your bill along. It's not just that it's good policy, it's that you paid attention to those relationships along the way. And that is what will get you to the end result. And there's a whole parallel process in the Senate. And one of the jokes in the House, it's a little cliche, but it is, the Republicans are our adversaries, but the Senate is our enemy. Because if the Senate isn't, often the Senate doesn't have the same priorities that the House does, even though they're controlled by the same party. And so if you're not paying attention to that, that's also a hindrance. Then of course you have to make sure the governor will sign it. So there's one more step in it. Lots of people to talk to along the way.
So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions tonight, but thank you so much for your time, Representative Horn, and your insight on all of our questions. And
thank you all. I hope you all seriously consider getting involved in government, in politics. Politics is really just what you believe in, and we need you. So happy to be here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for all your input And everyone else, you are free to go. Let's give Representative Horn a virtual round of applause, though.
Thank you. Thank you.